if you can.
Okay, will do. Go.
All right, Bismillah, I'm admitting everybody. Let's go.
Yep. So I'm just putting this down. All right, I think everyone's coming in shortly. Yep, we're all starting to come in. Wonderful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Thank you very much for being here this morning. It's about 12. I'm saying this morning, it's already afternoon. It's 12 o'clock now in Sydney. So welcome, viewers. Thank you very much for being here. We've got some more people coming in, slowly but surely coming in. Let me just make sure that everybody's here. Admitting all of them. There we go. Okay, I think everybody should be here, inshallah, or she'll get started. Okay, so once again, assalamu alaikum. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Annie McCann. I am one of the co-founders of the Right Pen Collective, which was a newly created network to support, connect, and empower Australian Muslim writers here in the land down under, in the hope that we'll see more books written and published by Muslim authors and creators on our Western bookshelves, just as commonly as we see Vegemite on the supermarket shelves. I can't believe that today is the day that we're actually finishing the Right Pen Collective's Australian Muslim Writers Virtual Festival. It's been an amazing week and a stellar lineup of amazing writers that have joined us to share their experiences with us. But we really could not close this festival without the one and only brother Waleed Aly. We know him as a writer, but you all know him from this amazing journalist and host of Channel 10's The Project. Brother Waleed, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. I'm absolutely starstruck to be sharing the virtual stage with you.
So thanks very much for having me.
Oh, welcome, Salam. Thank you very much. Look, before we get started, I would just like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting today. Specifically, I'm coming to you live from the land of the Darug people. I would like to extend my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge that the land that we're meeting on today is stolen land and sovereignty was not conceded. I'd also just like to let everybody know that we've got a chat happening. So if you have any questions for myself or our guest Waleed, please send them through to the chat. You can send them directly to me. My name is The Right Pen Collective, which is the top of the chat. And also, if I could just remind everybody that the Right Pen Collective network and this panel is a safe place. So please ensure that your comments and questions are respectful. Any form of disrespect or abuse will not be tolerated and you will be removed from the panel. So once again, I want to thank everyone for being here, for the amazing support that everyone has provided to the Right Pen Collective. It has been an amazing journey and experience hosting the Right Pen Collective Australian Muslim Writers Festival. It is an Aussie first, so it's an honor to be here. But I'd like to introduce you to our special guest to end the festival, Mr. Waleed Aly. Welcome again. Thank you for your time. Waleed, if you could talk us through, because we know you as a writer, you've contributed to quarterly essays, you've collaborated on a book, which we'll talk about later, but a lot of people tend to know you as a prominent figure in the media. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to media? What started this whole thing?
Yeah, I can, but to some extent, I don't really understand it myself. It was all a bit of an accident, actually.
Oh,
I mean, it's not to say that I never had an interest in media. I do remember when I was really little, I was fascinated with newspapers. Like I used to, so I live in Melbourne. So the main newspaper we got was The Age, which used to be a broadsheet, like the Sydney Morning Herald. And I remember when I was a kid, I used to open it and just look at it, and it was like bigger than me. And I got vivid memories of being a kid just sitting on the heater, because we had ducted heating at home, and I used to sit on the heater and just open it up and look at it. And like, I was really proud of myself if I read through a whole article, because they just seemed so long, and I'd turn over and look at the sports pages, and I was just fascinated by the whole thing. And I remember thinking when I was a kid, I'd start a newspaper for our street, and I never actually got anywhere because I couldn't convince anyone to join me in doing it. But it was kind of there in my mind. And then I remember I was in about grade 5, and this NBA legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was coming out to Australia to play a couple of exhibition games. It's good to see some fans.
yeah, sorry, we just got some messages saying that the volume is a little bit low.
On me.
I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you. But
is that better? Am I getting any better?
Much better. Yeah,
right.
That's a lot clearer. Thank you.
It's going through it's going through a box. So I just didn't want to turn any of the dials
Yes.
when I didn't know what
Oh,
was happening.
everyone's saying thank you. Much better.
No,
Thank you very
no
much.
worries.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so I remember when Kareem Abdul-Jabbar came out to Australia, I was really excited about that. And I decided, that was around the time I thought, maybe I want to be a journalist. So I remember recording the basketball game and then going home and writing a match report about it, which no one ever read. But like, so there were these kind of moments in my life where I was interested in media. But actually, when it all counted, it was not something that I was going to do. I got to the end of university. I did engineering and law as a double degree. And I thought about going into media at the end of that, but that was really mainly because I hadn't organized my legal career. And I applied for a cadetship at the age. And the way it worked was that you had to sit an exam, but the exam was on grand final day. And I really just wanted to watch the grand final. So I didn't go to the exam. Like it would be wrong to say that I set out in my life with this sort of unwavering determination to work in media. It obviously didn't happen that way. And I actually began as a lawyer, and I was a lawyer for a long time. But what really happened after that was September 11 came along. And I don't know the age of everybody who's watching this, but I'm sort of right.
Years old.
Yes, of course. I'm familiar with that number. I'm sort of that generation where September 11 happened when I was at uni. So
right. Mm-hmm.
I am the September 11 generation in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so out of that came a lot of things for me to be writing about.
Yes.
And I was, because of my previous fascination with newspapers, I was always dreaming one day that, one day I might get something published somewhere, And I remember writing some things as a result of September 11 and then the invasion of Afghanistan. And I thought, that's very kind of you to hold up my book. That's nice. Thank you. But I remember thinking, wouldn't it be great if one day I wrote something that was good enough to be published in the Melbourne University magazine? They were the limit of my horizons, and and then it happened. But actually, my horizons got lifted further towards newspapers when, totally by I was going to say by accident, but of course, as Muslims, it's there aren't really accidents. It's all qadar, right? But this was, in fact, something that has started on the day of September 11 itself. So. I'm a big fan of the Richmond Football Club in the AFL. And on the 11th of September 2001, they had a training session because they were in the finals. And the history of this club throughout my lifetime had been they were never in the finals. So I went along to watch them. And a journalist from The Age was there just covering the training session, as you would. And then, of course, he noticed me. I was there with my sister-in-law. She's wearing hijab, my nephews. So we kind of looked like a family. And we just went about our daily business and went home. And then, of course, the planes hit the towers. And then Richmond are playing that weekend in a semi-final against Carlton. And the journalist who was at that training session wrote this story about football going on at a time of adversity. And he's just this amazing journalist who I'd always loved. But he noticed me and he wrote a description of me and my sister-in-law in that article. And I'm sitting at the MCG, literally with a copy of The Age, waiting for the game to start. And I read the article and I'm like, oh my God, that's me. He's just written about me. And this was a guy, Martin Flanagan. I've always loved his writing. And so I just emailed him and I said, look, you don't know me, but you wrote about me. And by the way, this is who I am. And I'm really, I've always really been interested in newspapers, and I was thinking maybe one day I'd like to publish in one or whatever. And he amazingly just called me back one day, and I answered the phone, and he sort of said, look, hey, if you've written anything and you want me to have a look at it, then I'll have a look. And I was blown away by this. So I said, all right. And I sent him a couple of things I wrote, and then he called me back again, and I'll never forget this. He's sort of this old, gruff sounding guy, but he's the gentlest, loveliest guy in the world. He's a real poet. So in fact, his brother is Richard Flanagan, who's a, world nationally celebrated author. So
yeah, father of Kitty Flanagan.
Yeah. So
father of Kitty Flanagan,
yes. So
yes,
he called me, and he goes, I just answered the phone. Hello. He said, Waleed, it's Flanagan. That's how he talks. He said, Waleed, it's Flanagan. I said, oh, hi, how are you? And he said, mate, writing's like footy. You can either play or you can't, and you can play. And I'll never forget that sentence, or like that moment, because it actually is a really big deal. Like it sort of made me think that I had something worth saying. You know, and he said I still had to learn some things. He goes, you've got a diamond, you just need to learn how to cut it, was the way he described it. And then he sort of said, look, you know, if you ever write something that you think you want to get out there, let me know, and maybe we can sneak it into the paper. And that just blew me away, because up until then, really, that thought hadn't lodged as something that was realistic. It was not, I didn't imagine that. And, you know, there was trial and error. And eventually he put me in touch with the editor, and I sent a piece that I wrote in 2002, and it got published. And I'll never forget it. November 24, 2002, it was the Sunday Age. And I did not sleep that night. And I was just waiting for the newspaper delivery to come. And this, of course, was a time when newspapers were still overwhelmingly the physical form. The website wasn't that big a deal. It was, and so the moment when the paper boy delivers the newspaper was just huge. And I was like, my God, my name has just landed on my driveway. Like, it was, I'd never really experienced anything like that before.
Yeah.
And then from there, really my fascination was always with print. And I set myself the task of just trying to get published as much as I could. And a year later, I got another piece published in The Australian, because The Age, just for some reason, I couldn't convince the editor to publish me, but the guy at The Australian would. So I ended up being published there. And then after a while, I set myself a goal, which was that I was going to get published in a newspaper minimum every 3 weeks. I was going to get a piece in. And so I would scan all of the papers, try to figure out where the gaps were, what I could contribute to whatever issue. And I tried to knock off as many newspapers as I could. So I was like, yeah, the Herald Sun, the Daily Telegraph, the Canberra Times. I think I ended up in the Hobart Mercury at one point. It was just like anywhere. And I just set myself this goal, and I just constantly kept beating it because I was so determined. At the time, I was a lawyer, so this was terrible for my legal career, but I just couldn't help myself, really. And then everything else that you mentioned, I know you wanted to start away from writing, but everything else that you mentioned actually came out of that. Eventually, my pieces started getting noticed by other people. So a guy called John Fain, who's a real legendary broadcaster in Melbourne, who was in the morning slot on ABC Radio, so 774 here, the equivalent of 702 in Sydney. He spotted them and he asked me to come in and co-host with him one day. And then from there, I got asked to fill in for him and host his radio show. I'd never done radio, and suddenly I've been asked to fill in on like the most high-powered, intense radio shift that there really is in Melbourne. And I still remember my first ever shift. I walked in really not knowing what I was doing. And the night before the shows, it was the morning shows, I have to get in there at like 6 a.m. Overnight, Israel had just sent ground troops into Gaza. And this was like my debut on radio was dealing with that story, right? It was not, you know, you would hope you come in and they say, all right, our lead story today is, when do you prune your roses, or something like that? But no. It was
half your luck.
Yeah. And I'm doing talk back on it. And apparently within 2 minutes, like the Zionist Council was on the phone demanding I be taken off air. Like, it was just, I mean, it was just the deep end, right? Straight away.
Yeah.
But, you know, I did that a few times, and then that developed, and I must have been reasonably good at it because they kept asking me to come back. And then eventually they gave me a permanent show. They offered me a permanent show on Radio National when they launched the Drive program on that network. So I did that. And then alongside of that, some friends and I had just come up with this show called Salam Cafe, which we did on community TV, which then got picked up by SBS. And through all of that, I ended up being asked to do interviews on the project quite a lot, because a lot of the producers that started at the project when the project launched were actually from the ABC. So they knew me from there. And then the moment when I really started being part of the project family was actually, again, September 11, right? It was the 10th anniversary of September 11, and they were doing a 10th anniversary show, and they asked me to come in and be what they call the fourth. So, you know, there's 4 people on the desk, there are 3 people who are always there, and then the 4th one rotates. So they asked me to come in for that 10th anniversary show, and I did. And then they just kept asking me back. And I remember the second time I ever did the show, I was filling in for Charlie Pickering, who was the host, and I'd never really
Yep.
watched the show, but suddenly I was hosting it. And I just remember thinking, it was a weird situation that I was there at all. Like they were sort of saying that they call. I've been overseas. I'd flown in because I had to give a speech in Melbourne that day. I was jet lagged. I had a terrible headache. And this guy calls me and says, "Hey, if Charlie's sick, do you think you could fill in for him?" And I said, "What, like hosting the show?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, like inside, my internal monologue was, "No, I feel terrible. I don't think I would be any good at this. This is a stupid idea." But for some reason, what came out of my mouth was, "Yeah, sure." And then that afternoon, I was suddenly hosting the show. But the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, if it goes well, great. And if it doesn't, well, no one's going to remember. And I get to say I did it. That's a cool story, I guess. And I did it. And back then the show was half an hour. And I remember 2/3 of the way through, we're in an ad break. And I was sitting there and I was thinking, okay, Waleed, well, here's something you've discovered you are genuinely no good at. And, but, there you go. And so I just did it, finished, walked off. So, okay, great. I did it. That's fine. I get to say I did it one day. And the executive producer said, "Hey," after the show, he came up to me and said, "Hey, I didn't want to tell you this, but there was actually a focus group watching the show in Sydney and they thought you were great. And like, this is amazing. You should really, so they just kept asking me back. So, I mean, all of these things, like it would be wrong for me to say it was deliberate that I kind of ended up where I am. It was really just a matter of doing stuff when I was passionate enough to do it. And then walking through doors that were open for me for whatever reason and not being afraid to fail miserably. And then in the end, things kind of worked themselves out. Like it's, I don't, and that's why I often get asked by, journalism students or just anyone who's interested in media, how do you get into it? And I'm like, I'm the worst person to ask that question because nothing I can tell you is replicable. It was largely by accident. The only thing I can say as a matter of principle is if you do work, then sometimes you create work. That by acting, you can create opportunities, but that's not to say it's a guarantee, but I guess it's something that's happened in my case. Yeah.
I think calling it an accident does yourself an injustice. I think you earned your place there, Brother Waleed, and you worked to get to where you are, and it was like a natural evolution process, if you will, if for lack of a better word. So you've done something, you platformed, and you worked your way up that way. So it wasn't an accident that they selected you to be on the project and to keep asking you to come back. It was no accident for sure. And Brother Waleed, it's interesting, like your fascination with media and with newspapers struck me because I love reading newspapers, but unfortunately there is a lot of negative news reported, and particularly as like a Muslim reader, I cringe at headlines sometimes, and then I question, should I wear my hijab? Am I going to be the next target? As a journalist and a prominent figure in media in an age of Islamophobia and negative reporting on Muslims in Australia and around the world, how do you navigate through that? Like, what do you do? What do you do?
It's a very good question, but it's probably not one with a really clear answer. I suppose my starting point is now a little bit different. Because when I think about it, my starting point is a little bit different to the way that I hear other Muslims talk about it. And that is that I don't begin from the position that it's all negative and everyone's out to get me. And I don't really know why, because I've experienced all of that.
Yeah.
But I think what it is, I don't know, if you look at this Quranically for a moment, there's no verse that says everybody's going to love you.
True.
Like, that's just not an ayah. I'm not a hafiz, but I haven't come across that ayah. There are lots of ayats about how people won't like you. There are lots of ayats about that there will be people, and clearly not everybody, but there will be people who hold hatred in their hearts for you. And as far as I can tell, there's nothing in the Quran that tells you the correct response is to sort of sulk about that. So I guess what's happened, and this wasn't always conscious, sometimes I guess it was subconscious, but I guess what's happened is rather than being angry about the fact that, yeah, there's some bad journalism out there, and Muslims bear the brunt of it. And there is what I think in modern times we've come to call Islamophobia, but it's not a new thing. There are anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim attitudes out there that have existed literally since the Prophet ﷺ received revelation, literally since then. So I guess I've approached that as saying that's just a fact of the world. That's not something to be angry about. That's the world we've been given. And it's in that environment that we're being tested. Right? So ultimately, I mean, this is the great gift I think that Muslims have. Not just Muslims. I think a lot of religious traditions have this, but this is a great gift that Muslims have that I think we don't actually take anywhere near enough. And that is that we understand and accept that Allah is the author of history. So it's not really our job to be angry at the way, like to scream about how unfair things are. Like we're not facing a level of unfairness that even gets close to the level of unfairness that the Prophet ﷺ faced. Or yeah, the one I often think about actually is Nuh alayhi salam. Whenever I read his story, it's like 950 years of being ignored. Like 950. Like I go 3 weeks and I'm beside myself. So, I think once we change our mindset and we go, okay, whatever happens is qadar. We're not guaranteed. This life is not meant to be Jannah. It's like dunya is an abode of tribulation. That's what it is. The question is how we respond, and we are not responsible, and we shouldn't get hung up on outcomes. Like that is to be obsessed with. That is a way of thinking that I just don't think belongs to us as Muslims. It shouldn't, right?
Yeah.
The people I feel sorry for are actually in this respect are people who don't have iman, or they don't have faith, because actually all they then have is misery. Like there's no if the world doesn't obey their will, then suddenly they're really upset about it and there is no recourse. Whereas like we're just passing through here. And I don't usually complain too much about the airport. Like I'm not obsessed with that. And sure, it doesn't mean it's easy, but I guess what that means is when I look at the treatment of Muslims in the media, I don't know, it's hard to pinpoint a moment where that I felt that way or whatever it was, but I guess I just look at it and go, well, yeah, of course. The question is, what now? What do I do about that? And so, to me, sorry, and then I should add that that's also not universally true. Like it's a problem I've had for a long time is the way that people talk about media is really blunt, like, and overly generalized. Like the media is a very broad collection of companies and institutions and people, and they do all kinds of, like, there's plenty of positive stuff. There are plenty of opportunities to contribute. There are not everything's going to go your way. And as I got closer to media and I got closer to seeing how people respond to media, the other thing I picked up, which I find interesting, and I think Muslims probably will find this hard to believe, is that actually everybody thinks the media is out to get them. Everybody. Like I've had conversations with like the Liberal Party thinks the media is out to get them. The Labor Party thinks the media is out to get them. The Greens think that. One Nation thinks that. I've spoken to people who are like fiercely pro-Israel who think the media is just outrageously stacked against them. And you don't need to tell me what someone who's pro-Palestinian would think. And if everybody thinks that, then something's either very wrong or quite right about the situation. And actually what's probably
Interesting.
happening is there are lots and lots of different things happening that are completely pulling in opposite directions. And one of the consequences of that is that we tend to identify the things that go against us and fixate on that. Now, in saying that, I'm not being blind to it. I understand that, overall, like if you did it on balance, I don't think Muslims come out well from the way that media interacts with it. Sure. But that doesn't mean that there aren't contributions to make, and it doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities there. And so when I think about when I was writing in that sort of post-September 11 period, one of the reasons I was getting published, I think, was that there was a thirst for hearing what I had to say. So that there was a genuine interest and a genuine curiosity. And a lot of media outlets, I don't think, had access to anybody who was a Muslim, but could speak across what was becoming a really quite large chasm between Muslim Australia and wider Australia at the time. Wherever you go, there will be people of goodwill, and there will be people of ill will. And I suppose all you can do is be patient with the people of ill will, and be open and work with the people of goodwill. That's kind of all it is. And then beyond that, I think it comes down to having a fairly clear view of the lay of the land, right? So there are bits where you have to be wise in what you talk about, what you say, how you say it. And that's not a matter of being devious or anything like that. It's just a matter of saying, okay, I need to understand that when I say X, it's likely that Y will be heard. And so I can't say X and then complain that Y is heard. I need to be sure that I don't mean to say Y, because that's what people are going to hear. And that's especially true, I think, so at the time I was on the board of the Islamic Council of Victoria. So there was a community representation element to what I was doing as well. And so that's particularly true in those cases. Now it's a little bit different. When I write a piece so I write a, column for the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age or whatever, sometimes I go, look, I'm going to make an argument here that's quite subtle. And I know, especially in the age of social media, people are going to misrepresent that. And there comes a point where I can't be held responsible for that. All I can do is offer it in good faith. But I don't think you can be reckless or stupid about that as well. I think part of entering into the public conversation, whether it's via media or anything else, is getting to a point where you actually understand the public conversation, the dynamics of it, the axioms of it well enough that you know how to navigate it. And it's very hard for me to, talk about that in a Zoom session, but it's an important part of the equation, I think. Sorry, definitely. I know I gave a really long answer to that, but I actually think it's
very interesting response.
Because I do think sometimes Muslims forget to factor in the Islamic bit. And I understand
that's the human side taking over.
Like I'm not blaming or attacking people for that. I mean, I do that often, but I think it's important to try to remember it sometimes. Sometimes we're using other people's worldviews to try to analyze ourselves, and we shouldn't really have to do that very often.
100%. No, that's a very interesting approach, I have to say. And rather than looking at that as, it's an attack, this is an opportunity for us to, contribute to the space and potentially turn things around, which is very interesting. So we had a question that had come through from the audience. I don't want to miss it. So let me just double check. Okay, so Maria Bhatti, thank you very much for your question. Maria would like to know, do you think the narrative has changed now, i.e. there's been a lot of discussion in the Muslim community about how post 9/11 Muslims were expected to counter narratives, i.e. we are not terrorists, we are Australian just like you, I wear the hijab and watch footy. Yeah, I've said that many times. It seems the Muslim community is now moving away from that discourse, i.e. why should we reinforce this narrative and be defensive, instead shifting the focus to the structural injustice which cause racism and Islamophobia rather than that Salam Cafe discourse of proving ourselves?
So what's the question exactly? Do I think it's changed?
Has it changed? Yeah. Has the narrative
Um,
changed in that time?
Well, I don't know. Muslims are a very diverse group of people, so I think it depends who you're talking about. I do think that there's clearly and the advent of social media has changed just so much.
Mm.
I actually would say mostly for the worse, but that's a separate argument, which I'm happy to have, by the way. But so I think what's happened is that a strain of discourse from amongst Muslims has emerged. That is the way that that question or that statement describes, right? That's very much, it's the product of probably a lot of Muslims having gone to university, studied arts degrees, or hung out with people who've done arts degrees, picked up some sort of postmodern critical theory, and started running with that, particularly in a social media setting, and then that's kind of taken hold. And I think that looks like a really big part of the Muslim response at the moment, because because I think that's the perspective of the loudest voices, particularly on social media, and then it bleeds occasionally into, publishing a piece in one of the newspapers or something like that. But I don't know that that's the attitude necessarily of most Muslims privately, so much as those who speak, right, and who speak quite loudly about it. But also, I think while you can identify this adjustment, it's a bit of and I think it's a true observation that has happened, like that kind of shift has happened. I think we've got to be careful here not to mischaracterize things or to draw comparisons that aren't really directly comparable, or that aren't very sound comparisons. So, for example, the idea of countering narratives, I think that was definitely part of the post 9/11 Muslim response, but I think it's actually a bit simplistic to characterize the post 9/11 Muslim response that way. Part of what was happening, I think, was countering narratives, but part of it was actually trying to claim a space where Muslims could actually express who they were and what their attitudes actually were. And so a Muslim who says, I wear hijab and watch the footy, I think it was.
Yeah, I remember I've said that myself over the years.
And I think I spotted your Parramatta sticker.
Yes, go the
Yeah.
Eels. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah. Now, it's one, you could look at that and say, well, that's just, apologetics and being defensive. Or you could say, well, no, maybe that's actually somebody saying what they are.
That's me. Exactly.
They're
Unapologetically.
actually
Yeah.
just saying, no, this is who I am. And it's relevant to say that at a time when the assumption is that that cannot possibly be true. Right? And so I think what's happened with the sort of, let's call it the second strand of discourse, which the question talks about, right? That second strand, I think, mischaracterizes the first strand often as being purely about apologetics, rather than actually being about an attempt to represent oneself in a way that's authentic. It might come across as defensive because it's happening in an environment of being on the back foot, right? But that doesn't mean it's not trying to speak a truth, actually, and a truth that might be quite important. And an understanding that sometimes these are important things, like foundations to lay, because it was only after you laid those foundations that you were in a position really to say anything else. But the second point I would say is, I don't think it works really to compare, if you want to say this is about two different discourses, I don't think it works to compare the discourse of a post 9/11 era to a discourse of an era in which 9/11 is really a fading memory. I mean, a lot of the discussion, shifting the focus to structural injustice, the cause of racism and Islamophobia, etc. There's a reason that didn't happen in a post 9/11 era. And if that tried to happen in a post 9/11 era, I suspect it would have been an unmitigated disaster. Because narratives and discourses, all these words, they tend to find the environment in which they can actually flourish. And I just don't think that was an environment in which it was going to flourish. I do also think, and this is, I mean, a different, a conversation we can have at more length, I suppose. But I do think there is a bit of a danger in the way Muslims, or certainly vocal Muslims, are flocking to that kind of discourse, this sort of structural injustice discourse. And that is that, I mean, at the risk of getting a bit too academic about it, what you can very quickly end up doing is end up in a situation where you're becoming very well practiced at a discourse of deconstruction, just perpetual deconstruction. And that's fine, there's some values to that. But the problem comes where if that actually becomes your predominant mental habit, then I think what can happen there is that you end up resisting any kind of overarching notion that there are certain things that we just don't deconstruct, by which I mean Islam.
Yeah.
And I've started to pick up this trend, I think, that has worried me a bit, that Muslims' discourse about themselves has become so political first that it seems to forget that there's actually there's a whole aqidah here. There's a fiqh there. And we might end up just deconstructing ourselves out of existence. This is one of because what we're doing is creating a political existence rather than a religious or a spiritual existence. You know, so I mean, these things you can always draw on different tools, but I think there's a concern there, and you know, you do see signs of it. I mean, at the extreme end, I've seen examples of people saying converts shouldn't be wearing hijab because that constitutes, you know, cultural appropriation or something. It's like, well, I mean, at this end, what you're beginning to do now is really, you know, I'm not sure what the relationship to Islam itself is there at that point, you know.
People just lay on their opinions, I guess, without fully understanding the situation.
It's where we construct ourselves politically. I mean, I think part of, if you look at the first narrative that question mentions, one of the things I think that was aiming to do was create space for Muslims to construct themselves in a way that's other than political.
Yeah, that's true to them.
Yeah. Oh, is that Austin talking? Yeah.
And I think that's actually a really important point to bear in mind, because Islam is not a political ideology. Right? There are political dimensions to it and so on and so forth, but it's not actually the same thing. So, and one of my big frustrations in the 9/11 era was that Muslims were overwhelmingly being pushed into the corner of being a political identity. That's why I hated the term moderate Muslim, because it's like a moderate is what you say to describe someone in a political party, right? We talk about moderates in the Liberal Party or whatever. So this was a way of talking about Muslims as a political party.
Yeah.
And so I think the attempt to resist that and to say, no, I'm not going to construct myself wholly politically, I think is actually a really important enterprise for Muslims to be involved in. I mean, look, there's endless discussions about how you do that in detail and whatever, but I think there's just some broad principles that I think are worth keeping in mind.
Definitely. I'd like to bring Sister Arkson and Sister Uzka into the conversation. They're our co-founders of the Right Pen Collective. But quickly, just before I do that, I wanted to make mention that recently Waleed Aly co-authored or collaborated on a book with Bachar Houli. And that book is available through Better Read Than Dead, our festival partners. The link is in the chat. So if you wanted to grab a copy of that, I'm pretty sure that is very well worth the read. Oh, there we go. We've got a picture of that. Thank you so much, Sister Arkson. Thank you. And Sister Uzka, if you're there, if I can get you to come in as well when you're ready. But yes, Sister Arkson, if you had a question, please.
Waleed, in relation to that question, you know, I really wanted to it was a good point, very good point, and how we can remove ourselves from being politicized. Now, you know, in the 2 decades, it's been almost 20 years, isn't it? That after post 9/11, this book, to you writing this book, now there's a world of difference, isn't there? Now we have in this book with Bachar that you've co-authored is really about the deeper side of faith. You know, first his identity as a Muslim is at the foremost, is really about the the whole book is about how he lives his faith within his profession and without nothing taking away from that. How did Australian media and print and literacy come this far? Difference between that to this, where we can unapologetically write our own stories like this?
So this is really interesting, actually, because in some ways what you say is right. In other ways, the difference is less than it appears. You know, that first book probably could be written today. Obviously, the examples would be different and all of that sort of stuff. It could be different. It could be written differently today. Sorry, it could be written today. It would probably be less urgent today because we don't have conversations every day in the media about, you know, jihad or whatever, which is what we were having back then. But it would still be relevant, right? Like in some ways, what's potentially dispiriting if you don't just submit yourself to, you know, the qadr of Allah, but what's potentially dispiriting is that all of the same questions and all of the same issues are still present and they're not going anywhere. But then again, if they've been around for 1400 years, they're not about to disappear quickly. The Bachar book's fascinating though, because the reason the Bachar book, the reason that exists, I think, is that Bachar exists. So in other words, he created a discursive space for him to speak that way by the fact that he has won 3 premierships playing for Richmond. And that he was part of that thing that is probably amongst the biggest institutions that exist in Australian cultural life. That he found his way as a Muslim in this world and in the world of football, I mean, and then just was himself. He was a Muslim. Mm-hmm. And then people became interested in what that meant. So what I love about Bachar's book, and you know, I need to say here, I mean, I wrote the words, but I wasn't trying to impose my view of anything. Like I sat down with him, I interviewed him a whole lot, I interviewed a whole lot of other people, and then it's like my job is now to capture what he's saying. You know, even if his view of something is very different to mine, it's his view that matters. It's his book. That's what I'm writing. It's not my view that matters. But what's interesting about it is I actually don't see that he's writing a book about Islamic identity at all. I think he's writing a book about Islamic practice and Islamic theology, like the way he views the world as a Muslim. And I think they're really, really different things. I actually think Muslims spend too much time talking and thinking about identity and nowhere near enough time thinking and talking and doing practice. Right. So one of the things that's interesting I find is whenever I sat down and spoke to Bash, he would, like if he was expressing some point of frustration with his career, he would very quickly retreat. Well, not retreat, retreat's the wrong word. He would very quickly move to some kind of Islamic concept that would understand the situation that he was in. Right. When he, I mean, I'm not going to assume people here know his career at all well, but when he was undergoing a really difficult time in his career at Essendon. So he started at Essendon before he went to Richmond. He wasn't really getting a game at Essendon. He was a lot of his he went through terrible injuries. He wasn't getting selected. It looked like his career was coming to an end. He understands that whole period, really, it seems, through concepts like sabr and qadr, or the idea that we may love a thing that's good for us. Sorry, that's not good for us, and we may detest a thing that is good for us. This idea, I think it's Surah Al-Baqarah. So that's the way he understands his life, and that's the way he wants to tell his story. That's not identity. That's practice, and that's theology. They're different things. And it's, I think if you walk too far down the identity line, I think that's actually where you end up politicizing yourself. And it's like, yeah, I'm reducing my existence to a political existence, when actually primarily what we have is a spiritual existence, right? In the sense that that's what's called to account on Qiyamah. So I think that's one of the reasons I really enjoyed writing the book, was I could see that's where he was going, and it gave me the chance to then express that stuff in the telling of his life. So his understanding of success, and this is a guy who in the world of football has ended up having an extraordinary level of success. I mean, it's very rare to win multiple premierships, right? Not that many people get to do that. He can write about that, or he can talk about that, but he's not talking about, well, then I got this kick and then I handballed it to this guy, and then, you know, I held up this cup and then I went and, like, he's, you know, and here's the strategy that we used to beat GWS or whatever. Like, that's not what he wants to, and he allowed me to talk about that as being a story that is to do with shukr and humility. So in other words, he's telling, he's describing Islam, right? But the thing that's made that possible is that he's made clearly a huge contribution to the lives of all these people. People want to know what Bachar has to say about that, and they want to know how his mind works because they've seen the fruits of it. Right? Not only have they seen him play good football, and he did play really good football, especially at the back end of his career, but they saw the way his teammates spoke about the impact he had on the culture of the club, or the way his coach speaks about him as a really special individual within the club. That is because he had manifest Islamic practice rather than Islamic identity. People who otherwise wouldn't have had any reason to think about Islam look at that and go, there's something behind this guy. I want to know what that is. Yeah. And so they pick up a book where he now tells them what it is. And they go, oh, wow, all right, that's interesting. And that's kind of how Dawah works. To come back to the question before about the two competing narratives, I think what is completely absent from the narrative, that sort of second narrative, this sort of more postmodern and critical narrative, is it has no interest in it, is in some ways actively hostile to Dawah, which is actually an obligation. It's not like, it's not an apologetic. It's an obligation, right?
Yeah.
Bashar's very concerned about it, actually. And I think what's interesting, what goes hand in hand in that, is his understanding of himself, from what I could gather. And obviously I spent a lot of time with him, and I've known him since before he was in the AFL. So I've known him for a long time, and I think I've got a fairly good sense of the way he thinks about these things. His understanding of himself and his situation is not really a political one. It's just not. There's an incident in the book where he talks about being, I suppose you could call it racially or certainly Islamophobically abused during a match. It was against Collingwood. He was taking the kick in. So he went to get the ball, and as he bent down to pick up the ball, he heard one of the Collingwood members or the cheer squad shout at him and calling him a jihadist. Right? And this would have happened in probably the second quarter. And then he's kept that with him the whole game. Yeah. He played well that night too. I think he got 30-something possessions, which is quite a lot. Yeah. But he, all game, and he was telling me about this, he's sitting there saying, if I speak to that guy, if I get a chance to speak to that guy after the game, what am I going to say to him? And so he's playing a game of AFL football against Collingwood and composing in his mind this thing, right? Yeah. In the end, Richmond lose the game from an unlosable position. They're 3 goals up with a couple of minutes to go, and Collingwood kick 3 goals. Most of the Collingwood fans aren't in the ground anymore. They've all gone home early. That's how gone this game was. Heartbreaking loss. And you can imagine the Collingwood fans, that are left are pretty happy about it. And it's a pretty embarrassing situation for a Richmond player to be in. But he goes to the cheer squad and he finds that guy and he engages him in conversation. He doesn't yell at him. He doesn't try to get him kicked out of AFL footy for the rest of his life or anything like that. Because for him, the way he's thinking about it is not, how do I don't know, dismantle structural racism in this moment or something. I mean, he could have thought about it that way and it wouldn't necessarily have been a bad thing, but it's not his instinct. His instinct is, how do I give dawa to this guy? So he goes up to him and he says, hey, listen, what you called me is not right. And here's why it's not right. And if I was what you say I am, then we'd be having a very different conversation right now. And blah, blah, blah. And then this guy who's in the Collingwood cheer squad, all his mates start siding with Bash. So start saying, yeah, like it was a stupid thing he said. He shouldn't have said it. It's like, blah, blah, blah. You're right, Bash, blah, blah, blah. The Collingwood fans start supporting him, right? The security guard comes over to try to sort it out. He says, don't worry, mate. It's okay. It's fine. We're just having a chat. He does everything he can to keep it out of the media because he doesn't want this guy's life to be destroyed. He just wants to take. So I guess that's the thing about Bash. It's interesting. One of the things I really admire about him is that he isn't thinking through the prism of political calculation or anything like that. He's thinking through the prism of what's the best thing for me when I'm standing in front of Allah. What's that?
Very interesting and smart approach.
Yeah, well, I mean,
yeah.
To me,
I don't think I would have the courage to talk to somebody like that if that was in me. So
yeah, look, it's not for everybody.
Full commendation. Yeah, full commendation to Bachar. Yeah.
But then it's interesting when you talk to him, so the people at the club who know him and the effect that he has on them, right? I spoke to his coach, right? And his coach genuinely gets emotional every time he speaks about Bachar because he's just an incredible person. Right? That's the effect that he has on him. And, his coach doesn't remember a lot of the detail of what Bash has said about him. And Bash is, every year, I mean, I suppose he's retired now, so it won't happen anymore, but every year his job would be to get all the new players that had just come into the club and he would have a barbecue for them and everything. And a barbecue at the Houli household you have to take the opportunity if you ever get it. It's quite an amazing thing. But
starve yourself before you go.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous. But he and it's one of my favorite interviews is when I went and interviewed a couple of his brothers and his dad at their house, and they just fed me, and it was amazing. But that's his job, is to work with those younger players and bring them into the club that way. And then he does this presentation on Islam for them. Right? There's this moment in the book where he just comes up with this presentation to do for the club. This is at the time that ISIS kind of emerges, right? It takes over Mosul. So you can imagine how people are feeling, and he's detecting people are uneasy. And he's like, all right, I'll just give a presentation. Now, he's not giving a presentation that's like high-end academic level, and he's not dealing with an audience that's high-end academic audience. And to some extent, the things he says to his peers would probably only go so far in an environment outside the footy club. But he's not outside the footy club. He's in his environment and he's dealing with that. And it's interesting, you talk to the people who spoke to him about those things, and it's like they don't even necessarily remember the details. The coach, Damien Hardwick, ends up asking him about Sunni and Shia. I mean, imagine this happening in an AFL club, this conversation. He doesn't remember the detail. He couldn't even remember who the Shia was. He goes, who are the people? There was I can't remember the names. I think Sunni was one of them, and I don't remember so he doesn't remember the details, right? But he remembers the conversation, and he remembers the connection that came through that conversation. So they're the stories you kind of just keep hearing with Bash, or the fact that he was able to walk into a footy club and reach a point where he would say, "Guys, I'm not going to go out drinking with you. I'm not going to do that," or say to the footy club, hey, is it okay if I don't come to this particular event, this club function, because there's going to be alcohol there and I don't really want to be there. Now that takes a lot of guts to do that, right? And not all Muslims would think it was necessary to do that either. I'm not saying that that's the only way to do it, but he'd reached that point. But the way he was able to do that because they would say, this is a guy of integrity.
Yeah.
This is a guy who's not trying to get out of something.
Yeah.
This is a guy who will make good. So the example in one of the chapters, I can't remember the chapters of the book anymore, but one of the chapters, the example was the football club have sponsors. So each player has a sponsor. It's basically just a way of getting money for the club. So people say, I'm going to be your sponsor this year, and I just pay however much to the club. And it means I get to catch up with this player privately for, a bunch of times throughout the year. And so they had this club function for all the sponsors. And there's going to be alcohol there. So Bash says he doesn't want to go. And the club says, okay. Now that's a big deal because one of the whole reasons you're a sponsor is that you get to go to these functions and get access to these players, right? So it's a big call. But he says, all right, what I'll do is I'll arrange a different thing. I'll go and take my sponsors, I'll take them out for lunch. And then they can go to this function, but then they can also have a better time because they even get another function with me that's much more intimate and we can, hang out. So he would come up with a solution. When Ramadan arrives, I mean, playing through an AFL season in Ramadan is not an easy thing. And it's not game day. It's things like, how do you convince the club to let you train differently or whatever? Well, he could convince them because they trusted him, because they saw he was trustworthy. Right? And that's all those things are not about identity. They're about adab, they're about akhlaq, they're about practice.
Practice, 100%. Yeah. 100%. Oh, I'm looking forward to the day that I get a chance to interview Bachar once I've read his book. I'm really excited to read the book. I hope, inshallah, one day I'll get to meet him as I've met you. And just also to the viewers, don't forget you can get Bashar's book that was co-written with Waleed Aly through our festival partners, Better Red Than Dead. The link is on the screen and there's free shipping as a thank you to this festival. So look, Brother Waleed, I want to thank you very much for spending your afternoon with us and talking to us about your journey and just fantastic approaches that you've taken to life in general. I want to thank you for sharing that with us and spending your time on this festival. It's unfortunate that we don't have a lot of time, so I do have to start wrapping this up. First of all, I want to give a shout out again to Better Red Than Dead. Thank you for your amazing support throughout this entire festival, from planning, promo to now. I also want to give a shout out to Print on Collins, our festival partner, who did all the promo clips. It was an amazing job that you saw all over our social media. I also want to thank our guests from the beginning, Dr. Randa Abdel Fattah, who opened the festival with us. I'd like to also thank our poets who were our guests, Rania Ahmed, Mariam Azam, and Sarah Saleh. I would also like to thank our international guests who spent their morning, well, it was our morning, their evening with us, Asma Zenahat Khan and Uzma Jalaluddin. I'd like to thank our Kids Lit panel, Tamara Haak, George Green, and Uzga Sevendik Alkan, who is our co-founder. I'd like to thank our picture books panel, Inda Ahmad Zari, Amal Abu Eid, and Amran Abdi. Middle grade space, Malati Lam and Huda Hayek. I'd also like to thank our guests for the Love Oz Muslim YA panel that we hosted, Demet Divoran, Rara Arja, and Sarah Hagduski, who woke up at an ungodly hour from the United States of America to talk to us that day. And of course, last night's panel, our adult contemporary writing, Michael Muhammad Ahmad, I should say, and Amani Haidar. Last but not least, Mr. Waleed Aly, thank you so much for being here, being part of our festival. It was an absolute honor to share the virtual stage with you today. I'd also just like to quickly bring the co-founders in, if I could get you to spotlight for a moment. So Aksen and Uzka, I want to thank both of you from the bottom of my heart for that phone call that you made 6 months ago about this idea to put this network together, and for taking my idea on board of launching a virtual festival. I really thank you for trusting me with that and for being your MC. It's been an absolute pleasure. And inshallah, this is just the seed. This is just planting the seed, and inshallah, we're going to grow from here. One thing I really wanted to share is throughout the entire festival, I've had this song in my head that I feel that rings really true, and I wanted to share just some of the lyrics to our viewers. We have the chance to turn the pages over, to write what we want to write, because we got to make ends meet before we get much older. You are the voice, try and understand it, make a noise and make it clear. So if you are a Muslim writer aspiring to write your story and to get published, do not fear, don't hesitate, pick up that pen, go forth and write. You have an amazing support network through the TRPC. So if at any time that you have a question, you want some direction, or even just the support through a chat, please feel free to reach out to us, because inshallah, one day we will see more books commonly published by Muslim authors here in Australia. just some final words. I'd like to hand over to Sister Aksan and Sister Uska just to say thank you. Thank you very much for the ladies to be here.
I'll just start. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Waleed, for joining us for the closing of our festival. I want to start by saying a big alhamdulillah. The whole network started with a prayer to Allah saying that please allow us to get to know each other and continue to do this work together. And what I'm looking at the end of this 8-day festival is an answered prayer, and I'm so grateful for it. I want to say thank you to Annie and Ahsan, who did not even hesitate when I joined them with the idea of putting this group together. I want to thank Ahsan for coming up with our slogan of making books by Muslim Australians as common as Vegemite. And I want to thank Annie for having this idea for this festival and telling us that this is going to be great. We need to do this. I also want to thank Malati and Inda, who has done so much work behind the scenes, doing all the social media work for us. I want to thank all the authors. I also want to thank all the arts and creative writing organizations that have been so supportive of this. I have sent out so many messages, so many emails, and everybody from Writers Victoria to Diversity in Arts, and some other organizations just found us and started sharing our story. I want to thank them. And finally, I want to thank everybody who has supported us, who's been on Instagram, putting us in your stories, retweeting us, joining us on Facebook. Thank you for raising our voices, for amplifying our voices. And I'm going to say what Annie said as well. Please, your voices matter, your stories matter. Look at what Brother Waleed Aly started, just picking up that pen and writing that article. You can do that as well. Please pick up your pens, learn to write, and just raise your voices.
Amin. Thank you. Thank you so much. Aksan?
I'm not going to repeat anything. I just second everything that Özge and Annie said. Jazakallah khair, and thank you to everybody that attended and to all the audiences today too, and Waleed for not letting us down, despite how busy he is. But just very briefly, I think in a nutshell, what TRPC really was about, and we realized in this whole week, we're all excited amidst this chaos and this pandemic, and sometimes we had a little bit this guilt, a pang of guilt, like we're enjoying ourselves, but there's so much happening, so much chaos happening around us. But I relate that to a hadith, to a saying of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that even if in an apocalypse, the day of judgment has come, still sow a seed, still plant something. So despite what's happening around you, still be a beacon of goodness, however that may be. And TRPC envisioned that with the pen, because we know how powerful the pen is. So inshallah, I hope that it's going to, compel lots of people to own up to their voices, good voices. A lot of Muslim writers out there in the Australian market, you may not even like what they have to say, or you might say that doesn't represent me. It doesn't represent my community, because the Muslim community, as Waleed said, is very diverse. And I think, come out and then write that story. And I think it's a responsibility now, inshallah. So Jazakallah khair, thank you to everybody. And I hope to see you all at a bigger and better festival next year, face to face.
That would be wonderful, inshallah. Amin. And once again, to our special guest today, Brother Waleed Aly, what Sister Ahsan said, I know how busy you are, but the fact that you gave up your time to talk to us today, I'm truly honored. And as one of your biggest fans, I wanted to thank you. And inshallah, this is just the beginning. I hope to see you again soon, inshallah. Once again, to everybody, thank you very much for being here. To our guests, Jazakallah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much.